I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The sound of boys' voices carried strangely that evening, suspended between stone and mist, as though the very air of Oxford conspired to keep their harmonies trapped within the cloisters. I had paused near Tom Tower, the drizzle clinging to my coat, reluctant to move on. Christ Church had always unsettled me in a manner that other colleges did not. Too much grandeur, perhaps. Too much history demanding obeisance from men like me, who never quite belonged. The trebles were rehearsing an anthem I half remembered. Something about endings and beginnings, a minor key stretched thin. Endings. I had been turning the word about in my head since the morning, when my crossword had offered a clue both banal and, in its way, profound. Termination, 5 letters. I had written finis, though some doubt had lingered. So much of life consists of doubtful answers penciled in too quickly, left uncorrected until the whole puzzle is warped. Memory played its usual games, luring me into corners I preferred to leave dark. Old faces blurred by time, women whose names I remembered with an ache sharper than affection. The kind of recollections that arrive uninvited while one is merely waiting for the rain to slacken. I lit a cigarette, more for the ritual than the smoke, and watched the stone glisten under gaslight. Lewis had found me earlier in the day, carrying an expression caught between embarrassment and perplexity. He said there had been a note delivered to the station, anonymous, naturally. Words written in a tight, almost feminine hand. The footsteps ended at the wall. That was all. No signature, no context, just the suggestion of something unfinished, abruptly curtailed. I had turned the scrap of paper in my hands, admiring in a perverse way the restraint of its composition. A riddle without answer, more elegant than most of the letters we received from the crankish public. I asked him where it had been left, and he told me, slipped under the glass door, discovered by a constable on his way in for night duty. I had said very little, though already the words had begun their work upon me. Footsteps at a wall. I imagined a narrow street, perhaps, hemmed by buildings that conspired against escape, or a garden cloister where ivy disguised the stone and someone had walked until there was nowhere left to go. The phrase carried both menace and inevitability. The end of a path, the abrupt denial of further progress. In some moods I might have taken it for allegory, but police work trains a man to distrust allegory. Beneath most riddles lies the bruised face of fact. Lewis, ever practical, had wondered aloud if it were the product of some undergraduate's mischief. Students grew inventive when examinations loomed, but I had shaken my head. Mischief prefers parody, mockery, exaggeration. This had the brevity of desperation. Still, no crime had yet been committed, no blood drawn, no property disturbed. Only words, and yet words are not so innocent, or they linger, longer than the bruises they sometimes foretell. I slipped the paper into my pocket, folded twice, and told Lewis I would keep it for a while. He looked at me the way he often did, tolerant, faintly skeptical, like a younger man humoring an older one who saw patterns where there were only cracks in the pavement. The choir's singing swelled, then faltered, a note held too long by a voice not yet strong enough. I smiled, despite myself, though the smile felt older than I cared to admit. My feet echoed once along the stones, and then fell silent, as though they too had met some invisible wall. The rain thickened. I turned toward the street lights of St. Aldate's, the paper still pressing against my chest, whispering its unspent riddle. The footsteps ended at the wall. I could not yet say whose or why, but I knew already that I would follow them. They sent for me because the gardener disliked mysteries, particularly those that disturbed the geometry of his borders. He said he had found the scarf while the dew still argued with the sun, and had left it where it lay because it did not belong to the roses. That was his phrase. I admired the severity. Nothing in Oxford quite equals the pride of a man who keeps order among thorns, and nothing unsettles such men more than a colour out of place. The garden pressed against a cloister wall, old stone softened by ivy and the easy arrogance of spring. Rain had visited in the night. The soil kept a dark sheen, like a thought not yet owned. The scarf was pale blue, the sort of blue one meets in chalk streams and in the eyes of people who never quite focus on you. It had threaded itself into the ivy, as if climbing for safety and then changing its mind. Lewis stood a step behind, patient as ever, reciting the gardener's name and years of service. I let the information slide away, because names rarely change a wall. I asked about footprints, and he guided me to the border path. Gravel surrendered nothing, but the damp earth by the masonry showed scuffs and little half-moons where a heel had slipped and been corrected. Someone had paced too close to the wall, turned, hesitated, and then the story ended. The marks stopped as cleanly as chalk at the edge of a slate. The gardener muttered that students were forever climbing, though not usually in silk. I asked why he had not removed the scarf. Objects in gardens, he said, were weeds or decorations. This was neither, and therefore for the authorities. There was comfort in his taxonomy, a private constitution enforced with trowel and twine. I envied him the belief that everything could be put back where it belonged. At the porter's lodge, a notice had already been taped to the glass. Missing, Eleanor Reeves, Bodleian Archives. Last seen yesterday evening leaving the old school's quadrangle. The photograph did her no favors. A serious face, more absorbed than pretty, the look of someone who prefers paper to air. I remembered the anonymous line brought to the station and felt the echo tighten. The footsteps ended at the wall. If melodrama, it was an unusually literate kind. Back in the garden, I permitted myself the ceremony of kneeling. The ivy at shoulder height showed a dull smear, the green cooled by something damp. One strand had been torn near the mortar, not cut but worried until it surrendered. In the scarf's fringe I found grit, the fine crumbs a coping stone collects like unspent sentences. So it had rested higher, then fallen or been dragged down. I told Lewis. He nodded with that courteous impatience reserved for my small triumphs. We asked after Eleanor. The porter called her diligent and undemonstrative. She worked late, carried a satchel, had mentioned an early morning in the stacks. No one had seen her beyond the gate. I telephoned the Bodleian and reached a woman whose voice had the dry authority of uncatalogued folios. Yes, Reeves. Yes, 18th century correspondence. Yes, a fastidious worker. Paper rustled between her syllables. As an afterthought, she added that Reeves had sought access to the college's ecclesiastical records. The chaplain's permission would be required. Evening began to reassemble itself. The hour tasted of wet stone and soon-to-be music. I stood again by the wall and asked Lewis whether he believed in vanishing acts. "People go somewhere, sir," he said. "Our work is to draw lines until one of them meets a door." I told him the ground had tried to speak and then thought better of it. He smiled as men smile at poetry. I took the scarf. Order would not be restored. Walls practice silence better than we do. We found her room in the archives annex, where light arrived, chastened by blinds, and the air tasted faintly of paste. Desks exhaled paper dusk. A dehumidifier kept its tired vigil. Lewis said it was what you would expect of someone who preferred order to air. I told him that order is a species of air, and he let the remark pass the way. A sensible man lets a drizzle soak the hat he never liked. Facts first, because they resist romance. Eleanor Reeves had been cataloguing a cache of obscure 18th century letters. A family's brittle self-importance pressed into ink, petitions for stipends, hints of favors, tiny scandals whose courage had long since faded. She had devised a scheme of cross-reference and provenance, exact to the point of kindness. The section head spoke of her with brisk approval that hid a twinge of dependence. People who keep us tidy are rarely thanked in full. Two colleagues drifted at the doorway, pretending to sort envelopes while listening. One admired Eleanor's tact with the eagerness of a pupil raising a hand too often. The other allowed a brief, careful smile when the praise grew generous. Lewis took their names. I kept the smile. Compliment misapplied leaves a bruise more certain than insult. Her desk displayed the economics of solitary intelligence, pencils paired to frugal tapers, a repaired ruler, headache tablets rationed like winter coal. An open diary lay mid-desk, a black ribbon pinned beneath the spine as though to stop time escaping. One page had been torn close to the stitching. The edge felt serrated, haste disguised as neatness. She wanted that page gone and the book uninjured, a compromise I understood too well. I turned back through earlier days. The handwriting leaned inward, tidy without prettiness, the script of someone who keeps feeling folded. Appointments, boxes relabeled, letters moved, and the occasional entry that read only silence. On the inside cover, pressure from the missing leaf had left a pale relief. I angled the lamp until 3 ghostly letters rose. Sell, and then nothing. A beginning without its sentence. A small photograph lay trapped beneath a blotter, the departmental kind taken for web pages. Neutral light, shelves like dutiful chaperones. She had the attentive stillness of people who prefer the world precise before they enter it. I watched it a moment too long, aware of Middle Ages' old confusion, whereby attention volunteers to be mistaken for promise. Lewis coughed gently, and I decided not to dislike him for being right about me. She lived alone off the Iffley Road. Neighbors knew only the early post and the patient click of a Yale lock. Admired by some, resented by others, the section head said, as if fairness were a law of thermodynamics. Last week she corrected a senior fellow's misdating, gently and in public. He laughed, then left with a mouth like a door settling into its frame. Genius for enemies, Lewis murmured. Only talent for accuracy, I said. Which is worse? In the bin, a drift of fibers suggested recent tearing, but the paper weight did not match the diary stock. I kept them anyway. On the sill, a fine chalk settled like pale pollen, as though a box had been opened there and permitted to breathe. The index cards in her tray counted badly. 47, 48, and then 50. Where is 49? I asked. Mislaid, said the assistant too quickly. Mislaying, I replied, is a verb for things one intends never to find. I wrote 49 and, beside it, sell. Small numbers sponsor large rooms. The scarf from the garden lay in my pocket, its cold memory against the coat lining. Somewhere a floorboard announced us to nobody. I asked for the key register and ran a finger down columns that pretended not to tremble. A code repeated, seawall, 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 notations against recent movements of boxes. Cloister wall, the assistant explained. A temporary storage niche. Temporary is a word that lies for a living, I said, and left it there. We stood at the door a last minute. Lewis wondered if we should alert the fellow she corrected. In time, I answered. First the wall, then the silence, then the missing page. He asked what the letters meant. I told him they meant that a name had started and then edited itself, and that people who begin names and stop are generally interrupted by love, debt, or fear. He said, which? And I said that the building would tell us once it had forgiven our curiosity. The college received us with that habitual courtesy which conceals the fatigue of centuries. Oak panels remembered arguments longer than our investigation would last. Portraits watched, some disdainful, some amused. We sat in a room where the fire had been coaxed more for tradition than warmth. Lewis produced his notebook. I carried only my memory, which has a sharper nib. Dr. Adrian Selwyn came first, a man who dressed his debts in silk ties and spoke as if charm were currency. He described Eleanor as diligent, a credit to the institution, one of those quiet ornaments the university prides itself upon. I asked where he had been the night she vanished. "Dining with colleagues," he said, "finishing late." His hand adjusted a cufflink each time I pressed him closer to the hour. A scholar's tick or a gambler's? He dropped a line from Milton that snagged my ear. Eve tempted with apples in lines that were not Milton's at all, but Dryden's. I made no correction. Misquotation, like debt, often signals haste. Margaret Carrow followed, her shoulders drawn tight as if the weight of the library catalogue had bent them permanently. She admitted no warmth toward Eleanor, not hostility either, merely irritation at her methods. I asked, in what sense? She said Eleanor catalogued as though history itself were accountable to her. Too independent, too certain. The words carried the cadence of grievance long rehearsed. She claimed to have been at home that evening with her sister on the telephone. She held my gaze without wavering, but her knuckles whitened around the strap of her satchel. There are truths people protect by tightening their hands rather than loosening their tongues. James Fenton shuffled in next, a junior fellow whose awkwardness arrived before he did. He kept smoothing the pages of a notebook that contained nothing but the title of his stalled thesis. When I asked about Eleanor, his eyes betrayed him before his voice found words. She was kind, he said. More than kind. She had helped him order citations when his mind refused. I asked if he had loved her. He stared at the desk grain as if it might supply courage. I liked her, sir, very much. His absence during the critical hour, he admitted, was spent walking the meadow paths, clearing thoughts. No witness, no alibi. A convenient void into which suspicion could easily be poured. Yet his clumsy sincerity pressed against me like an untuned violin, irritating, yes, but not false. Finally, Reverend Hale, a chaplain whose gentleness looked practiced, yet weary. His voice had that unhurried cadence acquired from reading poetry aloud too often in empty chapels. He said Eleanor had asked him for access to parish records, and he had obliged. Her interest in marginalia pleased him. He confessed to seeing her near the cloisters days before, speaking with someone he could not name. I asked why not. He said the dusk had confused his eyes. His hands trembled slightly when he folded them, not with age, but with the restraint of one concealing unease. Lewis looked to me for conclusions, but the evening allowed only shadows. 4 people, each with a fragment of truth, none offering a whole. Selwyn polished charm like a shield. Carrow let resentment seep through her precision. Fenton blushed with the helplessness of unspent love. Hale's kindness carried a bruise beneath it. On the mantel, unnoticed by them, a chessboard had been left mid-game. White queen advanced too boldly, black bishop lurking. I traced the pattern with my eye, and saw the inevitability of a check 3 moves away. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps everything. In investigations, as in chess, what is left half-played says more than the last decisive move. We closed the interviews, but their voices clung to me like the mist outside. Polite words, incomplete truths. Oxford is full of both, and so was that room. Selwyn insisted the line was Milton, and he delivered it with the ease of a man who expects assent. They also serve who stand and dream of kings. I let it settle among the coffee cups. The kings were his. The dreaming too. They also serve who only. No need to finish it. Misquotation is biography compressed. He had summoned us to correct his timings. The dinner, he now recalled, had lingered under a speech. Afterward, he walked the quad with a colleague until damp air persuaded him indoors. He mentioned fetching a shawl for a lady, shawl chosen for elegance rather than accuracy. I asked if she thanked him. Naturally, he said, in that tone where gratitude is both expected and imagined. Outside, Oxford wore a grey cap. Lewis returned with his tread. He had spoken to a scout and to a tenor with more zeal than pitch. Both remembered Eleanor in a curt exchange near the cloisters 2 evenings before she vanished. "Not a row," said the scout, "but the sort that ends a friendship." The tenor supplied posture, one holding ground, the other leaning too close. We walked to the cloister. Lamps hummed like bees. On a sill, a crescent of crushed wax suggested a candle had stood where none should. Rules are most often broken by the devout. On the flags near the wall, a narrow blue filament refused movement. I took it up. It rhymed, if not proved, with the scarf that had entered the case like a sigh one cannot quite place. The fashionable theme became Fenton's missing hour. A porter had seen him near the meadows at 9. At 10, nobody would swear to him. He wore anxiety tidily, as if pressed beneath books. He confessed to walking in circles and thinking about nothing in particular, a phrase that excites suspicion in those who have never walked in circles. "What music," I asked, "attended your emptiness?" "Bells," he said, "and rain-tapping hedges." He considered the floor as if it might volunteer mercy. Lewis, who dislikes ambiguity almost as much as hunger, proposed that the cloister quarrel and the unaccounted hour were companions. "They might," I said, and left the admission between us like a chair nobody sits in. "What troubled me about Selwyn's Milton?" he asked. "Embroidery. Those who cannot bear the austerity of a line seldom bear the austerity of truth." Back at the annex, I returned to Eleanor's desk. The diary gaped with its single torn page, the ribbon feigning continuity. A penciled note I'd overlooked flickered now. "CW, crypt list. I had assumed CW meant cloister wall. It might, or prefer a meaning waiting for us to deserve it." Beneath the blotter, the departmental photograph remained obedient. On its back, a pale rectangle showed that another image had once been taped there and later peeled away. The past edits, paper remembers. The morning's crossword wandered back. Termination, 5 letters. I had written finis, then crossed it for close, both too theatrical. In Oxford, endings arrive like rain deciding, mid-drop, to become mist. I thought of crushed wax, the blue thread, the tenor's silhouette. Disappearances prefer the passive voice. We saw Fenton again. He held his notebook as if it might yet yield an alibi. "Give me a day," he said, "and I will find someone who saw me. Time," I told him, "is generous to the innocent and the rich. Which are you?" He smiled without pleasure and said that he loved her, and that love does not keep time for the police. The admission did him no favors. Evening released its bells as we stepped out. I told Lewis I would dine later and walk the cloister until symmetry cooled my impatience. I did not correct Selwyn's Milton. Some errors ripen into confessions if left on the branch a little longer. I poured the whiskey without ceremony. Evening had closed its shutters and left me with the crossword Eleanor had abandoned, the paper folded as though waiting for a hand that never returned. I have always thought crosswords an impolite mirror. They tell you too much about yourself, not in what you solve, but in what you cannot. Her pencil had lingered on a clue that had now become mine. Wall without end, 7 letters. Walls I understood. Oxford thrives upon them, coaxing scholars into order while keeping the rest of us politely excluded. Without end. A hint toward eternity. Perhaps, though too obvious. I wrote perpetu and scratched it out. Another sip of whiskey improved nothing. Clues are like people. They need patience, not alcohol, but the latter will volunteer first. Lewis had gone home. He disliked my habit of brooding over papers with the bottle near. He once told me that loneliness was not evidence, but it always made me act as if it were. I asked him if marriage was the antidote, and he had smiled with that quiet pity younger men reserve for older ones who have missed their train. The crossword gave nothing, but the page carried her pressure. Faint ghosts of words she had considered, abandoned, erased. She had written eter and then stopped. It could be eternity or eternal or some other elongation of grief. I left the pencil where it was. Margaret Caro arrived the next morning with a face that looked as though it had argued with the mirror before agreeing to meet us. She carried a single sheet, folded twice, unsigned. She said Eleanor must have left it in her pigeonhole, though she could not be certain. The letter announced in clipped strokes that Eleanor intended to resign her post and leave Oxford. Personal reasons, it said. Gratitude, it added. The tone was as cold as departmental minutes. I read it twice and handed it back. "Did you think it genuine?" I asked. Margaret straightened as though I had accused her of disorder. The handwriting, she said, was not unlike Eleanor's, though a little faster, a little firmer. Eleanor had lately seemed troubled, had she not? Was it so unlikely she might choose departure over conflict? I told her that departure prefers hesitations and qualifiers. This letter possessed neither. It was like listening to a voice drained of all cadence. Margaret bristled, suggested perhaps Eleanor had grown tired of being undermined. I said nothing, for silence is a better net than argument. She filled it at once. She had resented Eleanor's autonomy, but she did not wish her harm. Then she left, leaving the unsigned sheet behind as though it might argue for her. Alone again, I reread the letter. The spacing between words betrayed haste, not Eleanor's careful metronome. And no woman as careful with books as she would spell resignation without its expected flourish of formality. The diction was male, in the way it dismissed feeling as indulgence. I folded it away, a counterfeit coin that might yet buy a truth. The crossword returned to me later, as music dripped faintly from a radio. Wall without end. Perhaps not eternity, but endless wall. Rampart, barrier, cloister. Cloister seemed too short, but cloistered fitted neatly. 7 letters. A state rather than a structure. A clue that described not stone, but spirit. I thought of Eleanor walking along the garden path, her scarf surrendering to ivy, her diary missing a page. Cloistered, confined, hidden, silenced. The answer felt near, but like all answers, it arrived too soon to be trusted. I poured the whiskey again, and the word lingered on the page without confirmation. Walls do not end. They turn corners, they shift into other walls. They collapse only when history forgets to pay attention. In Oxford, history rarely forgets. I closed the crossword, left the pencil where she had stopped, and listened to the bottle's faint sigh as if it too had read the letter and found it false. The claret had been breathing longer than either of us deserved, and Lewis eyed it with the weary tolerance he reserved for my better vintages. I poured 2 glasses anyway. Wine, like words, insists on being shared even with those who would rather keep their evenings sober. He took his reluctantly, and I began. I told him I no longer believed in the purity of accident. Eleanor might indeed have slipped, might have found herself where stone meets darkness and gravity completes the sentence. But the letter whispered of orchestration, not of her fall, but of its meaning. Someone wished to curate her silence as though it were another document for the archives. He frowned, muttered that perhaps she had written it after all. I reminded him that tone is a fingerprint, and this one was smudged. We let the fire carry its crackle. Rain began against the college panes, soft percussion that folded itself into our pores. He asked if I had anyone particular in mind. I said only that words reveal their authors, even when unsigned. He pressed, and I deflected. Wine makes confidences, but it also breeds evasions. Julia entered the investigation like a verse half-remembered. Not part of the initial cast, not quite peripheral either. She had known Eleanor well enough to dine with her, to borrow volumes, to walk her home once or twice through the meadows. When I asked about those evenings, she answered with a scholar's precision and a woman's instinct for omission. Details offered, details withheld. A pause too deliberate when she considered whether Eleanor had spoken of leaving Oxford. Her wit had the sharpness of flint, striking sparks even in conversation meant to extinguish. I found myself listening longer than necessary, inviting her words to stretch into digressions. Lewis noticed, of course. He notices everything I would prefer ignored. Later, he remarked that Julia had charm enough to distract me from the case. I told him charm was evidence like any other, and he said nothing more. But his silence was a verdict. Romantic longing has always been my most loyal saboteur. It plays at generosity while stealing hours of concentration. With Julia, it was no different. She wore restraint like silk, and I wanted to disturb it. Each evasion from her lips left me both suspicious and absurdly grateful. I asked again about Eleanor's mood. She said Eleanor had grown withdrawn, more so in the weeks before she vanished. I asked if she believed the letter genuine. She said perhaps, but her eyes, grey, unhurried, looked away at the crucial moment, as if searching for punctuation in the corners of the room. Later, with Lewis, I admitted that Julia troubled me. He said in what way? I told him she reminded me of women who understand too much and confess too little. He asked if I trusted her. I said trust is not a police category, and he laughed with a sadness I preferred not to examine. The crossword still lived in my pocket. Wall without end. 7. I unfolded it again, more for the comfort of ritual than any expectation of progress. Julia had glanced at it once in the lodge and remarked that she liked puzzles but seldom finished them. I asked her then what she made of that clue. She smiled, repeated it aloud, and said eternity is a dangerous word. Then she left. I wrote it down in my notebook, not the answer, but the way she had spoken it. A pause, a softness. Refusal to close the door. Lewis drained his claret, set down the glass with a thud. He said we should focus on facts, not poetry. I told him poetry was often fact in disguise. He shook his head, indulgent, as though humoring an old man and his indulgences. The fire died slowly. Rain thickened. I kept the crossword unfolded before me, Julia's voice printed between the penciled lines, and wondered whether my longing was only another form of misdirection. The business of accusation is rarely clean. Evidence piles like autumn leaves, and the wind insists they all point in the same direction. That week the wind favored James Fenton. He had loved her, badly and too openly. Others had noticed, and Oxford is not merciful to unpolished affections. He admitted to walking the meadows the night Eleanor disappeared, but no one could testify to his presence there. The cloister quarrel, glimpsed by scout and chorister, seemed to name him. His evasions, halting, perspiring, clumsy, only encouraged the tide. Lewis believed the matter straightforward. He said Fenton's story had the smell of invention, the solitary walk, the unmeasured hour, the silence where corroboration should live. He thought the man weak enough to be dangerous. Weakness, he reminded me, is often the parent of desperation. I did not argue, but silence is not always assent. Strange wanted conclusion. His voice on the telephone carried the impatience of administration. We had our suspect, we had motive enough, and Oxford would be grateful for the restoration of its equilibrium. He told me to press harder, to write my report, to let the Crown take over the burden. I murmured something about timing, about tying a bow too early. He sighed, called me fanciful, and rang off. I met Fenton again in his study. The air was stale with overread books, footnotes curdling on the desk. He sat hunched, worrying the edge of a notebook that seemed never to receive ink. He said he liked Eleanor, liked her very much. His voice snagged on the word liked, as though regret had caught in the throat. He denied harming her, denied quarreling, denied even the possibility of anger. But his denials had no architecture. They collapsed even as they rose. And yet, something in his stammered recital of the meadow hour stayed with me. He spoke of hearing bells strike, of rain ticking hedges, of a fox startled near the copse. Details too exact, I thought, too humble. Innocent men embroider their alibis with grandeur. Guilty men often starve them of color. His had the pallor of truth, or at least of memory. I asked about the cloisters. He said he had spoken to Eleanor once, briefly, a week before, about her work. He admired her precision. He stumbled, corrected himself, flushed. The scout's testimony could easily have mistaken a conversational shadow for quarrel. I noted it, but said nothing. Back at my rooms, I opened the crossword again. That stubborn clue, wall without end, 7 letters. Eternity, cloistered, barrier. I had written them all. My pencil hovered, unsatisfied. The phrase would not rest. The footsteps ended at the wall, the anonymous note pressed against every explanation like a finger against a bruise. If Fenton had written it, why send such a riddle when confession would suffice? If he had loved her, why mark the wall where she vanished as though carving epitaph into stone? Too literary, I thought. Too composed for his awkward hands. Selwyn, perhaps, with his taste for misquotation, or Hale, who read poetry aloud to the rafters. But not Fenton. His words lived small, unformed, unready for riddles. Lewis pressed again that evening, asked if I would commit. We had the weight of suspicion, the pressure of superiors, the convenience of narrative. I told him weight is not balance, and convenience is not truth. He frowned, loyal but restless. He wanted to help me see sense. I wanted him to let me keep my doubt. The footsteps ended at the wall. The words circled like a chant. Fenton's hour might be missing, but innocence sometimes loses time just as guilt does. I could not see him in the darkness of the crypt, pushing, shoving, silencing. What I saw was a young man pacing meadows, rehearsing courage, failing at love, failing at alibis, but not, at least not yet, at humanity. And so I resisted, quietly, obstinately. While Oxford's walls held their tongues, I kept mine also, waiting for the one detail that would move the leaves against the wind. It turned up as lost things often do, shyly and without apology. We were back in Eleanor's room, the afternoon colorless, dust turning in the narrow light. I was riffling pamphlets on the ecclesiastical shelf when a stiff slip broke rank and slid to the floor. Lewis stooped and held it as a man holds a delicate insect. He said it would be trivial. I answered that trivial is a word used by people who have not yet learned to be afraid of paper. The leaf had been torn clean from a diary, the serration tight to the stitching. A neat hand marched across 3 lines and then stopped as if called. Selwyn's debts. The wall closes in. No date, no signature. That sentence and a faint indentation where the pencil had pressed hardest. I felt the old lift in the chest when a puzzle admits it is not infinite after all. Lewis asked whether it proved anything. Not yet, I said. It remembered something for us. He suggested the note might be college gossip, overdrafts assigned to every silk tie in reach. Perhaps. Yet the phrasing was not gossip's. It was an archivist's entry, brief and damning, written for later recall. I thought of Selwyn in his immaculate rooms, polishing a cufflink while lines he called Milton wandered through Dryden. Scholars misquote when careless, but they do so with embarrassment. Selwyn misquoted with poise. It was theatre, a rehearsal of erudition to distract from something untidy under the desk. The wall closes in. I walked the route from cloister to cellar, from chant to airless quiet, where estates are kept liquid. Wine keeps second books. Colleges entrust their sins to ledgers. I asked the bursar for keys and was escorted by a porter who knew the way. Damp stone breathed around us. How the cellar ledgers sat on a side table, bound in a tired red suggesting honesty by exhaustion. I turned pages until arithmetic became language. Purchases, tastings, a benefaction here and there, then a pattern that refused the eye. Sales to private buyers, each in the same hand, all just shy of explanation. And beside them, in pencil, the thin initials AS, not always, but often enough to be indecent. Lewis leaned over, patient with his bafflement. "The college sells wine," he said. "Why should that startle me?" "It should not," I told him, but these bottles had been replaced on paper by ghosts. Rare entries recorded as moved for study dinners had, opposite, been redeemed by payments arriving late and in the wrong sums. 2 lines had been abraded, the paper rough as a healed scar. Tilted toward the bulb, erased figures rose like bruises. We looked further and found what wanted finding. Not wine now, but marginalia, numbers that echoed the catalogue of a high-street dealer in books. A parcel of early editions had been pawned for a grace of money. The dealer's monogram hid in a set of loops meant to be private. Yet privacy exhausts itself when repeated. Selwyn's debts. The wall closes in. Page and Ledger shook hands across a table neither could see. Back upstairs, the corridor smelt of rain reheated by radiator. I heard again the line he had embroidered. "They also serve who only stand and wait." He had inserted kings where waiting stood, drawing the eye upwards so we would not look down. Carelessness would have blushed. Performance bowed. The misquotation had been deliberate, a scholar hiding the noise of a till. I did not arrest him. I am not sure I even wanted to. Debts are a patient murder. They killed discretion first, then love, and finally courage. I placed the torn leaf in an envelope and wrote a date I was not yet certain of. The footsteps at the wall had not moved, but they had acquired a voice, and it sounded like a man counting coins in the dark. Selwyn received me with the elegance of a man who rehearses courtesy between appointments. His rooms smelled of polish and a subtler neglect. Books climbed the walls, a decanter waited like a tame vice. I declined the drink. I told him civility was Oxford's favorite disguise. He said he hoped necessities might be handled with civility, as gentlemen manage duels. I smiled and kept my hands in my pockets. I placed an envelope on the table. Inside, a torn diary leaf and a copy of a ledger. He looked at my hands rather than the paper, as though guilt could be located anatomically. I described what the figures made of his reputation. He replied that accounts are never simple. Benefactions lag. Dinners multiply. Bottles move for reasons of temperature and taste. When I pointed to the dealer's monogram hiding in loops of ink, his mask slipped the breadth of a breath. He said he had authority to dispose of duplicates. "Duplicates," I answered, "do not include first editions annotated by a donor's widow." He asked whether this was to be a seminar in bookkeeping or a conversation about tragedy. I said they were relations that often dined together. The carpet showed a lane where pacing had been rehearsed. At last, he admitted to meeting Eleanor the night she vanished. She had asked for a few minutes by the cloister. She had, he said, grown unreasonably exercised about matters beyond her station. She threatened to expose administrative irregularities, his phrase, and to write to the council. He warned her reputations are fragile vessels. She replied that truth travels without crockery. He said there, near the wall, words turned clumsy. She pulled away. He left her standing. I asked why he had not mentioned the meeting earlier. He smiled as at a foolish undergraduate. "Because narratives conspire against men in debt," he said. "Narratives require assistance," I told him. He lifted his glass, admired the color, and remarked that Eleanor had worn a pale blue scarf which the draught kept worrying loose. It distracted him, he said, from the finer points of ethics. I let the sentence do its work. The scarf had never been mentioned beyond the small circle that found it. The college had been spared that detail. How, I asked, did he know its shade? He blinked, then said, "Memory paints where eyesight fails." A scholar's mind supplies color. Which porter, I asked, told you? He named the one who had been on leave all week. We returned to the wall in words. He said he watched her step away and the night, being Oxford, performed its theatre and swallowed her. I noticed the Milton on his desk, open not at patience but at battle, as if his books might provide character references. I mentioned his earlier embroidery of the sonnet. He bowed to the charge with a flourish small enough to be habit. He preferred the spirit of lines to their letter, he said. I told him letters were all that kept spirits honest. I said the cellar would no longer protect him, nor ledgers that feigned exhaustion. Did I believe he had killed her? He asked. Belief is a luxury. I keep contradictions. The scarf, for instance, and the manner in which debt teaches men to push rather than yield. He said I romanticized necessity. Necessity seldom needs an alibi, I said. I left him to the books that would not testify. The corridor breathed its varnish. The quadrangle leaked a careful cold. The footsteps at the wall repeated in my head, not louder, but nearer. If he had left her alive, then the night required a second author. Oxford has never lacked for co-writers of tragedy. I went down the stairs listening for a detail I had not yet earned, and heard only the small, stubborn creak of the banister that had known him longer than truth had. Rain arrived as a tutor, correcting assumptions line by line. I went back to Cloister before first lecture, when college held its breath and Porter's kettle ticked like a metronome. Ivy argued with Stone. Lewis said we had scoured this wall already. He was right the way maps are, accurate and insufficient. I set my palm to masonry and felt cold disagree. Stone keeps one temperature, the way certain men keep one opinion. Here it faltered, warmer by a hand's breadth where growth thinned. A hairline ran down two courses like a seam unpicked. I pressed nothing. I pressed lower, and wall gave the smallest cough. Lewis stared. We worked at Ivy with restraint, 2 burglars at a sleeping house. An iron edge showed itself, not a hinge exactly, more the ghost of one. Behind a loosened block, a keyhole had been bricked but not filled. Mortar crumbled like stale scripture, with a bar panel yielded a ledger's width. Damp stepped forward and shook our hands. Inside, a stair fell into a draught that smelt of chalk and history. I went first. Each tread complained as if asked to revisit a quarrel. Lamp made a republic of light corridor attempted to veto. Halfway down, a fragment of blue waited on a lip of stone, thumbnail length. I did not pick it up. Proofs deserve their own gravity. At bottom, passage turned into crypt's outer throat. Floor kept a bruise of scuffing that had never learned to heal. 2 marks came close and parted, as if someone had recovered balance where darkness expected them to fall. I let night dictate, a quarrel above, a shove more cowardly than fierce, body catching air, then stone, footsteps that ended at wall because wall had opened. Lewis spoke softly. So she fell here. She came here, I said. Almost the same and not the same at all. Did Selwyn know of this door? He knew of walls. Men in debt always do. Perhaps he found panel after, perhaps before. Panic is an able locksmith. We stepped into nave where silence reads its own mass. In dust near a pilaster, letters had been drawn and half erased by a shoe. C.W. I'd seen it before, shorthand in her diary. C.W. Crypt list. Cloister wall, then crypt, a route disguised as notation. Eleanor was following records, not romance. On way back, I let lamp lead. Above, panel yielded more readily, the way a lie improves with practice. Courtyard had filled with rain, flags dark with that scholastic melancholy Oxford rehearses so well. I leaned on jam and tasted metal. Steps had not been hidden from malice. They had been hidden from time. Selwyn's story returned. She pulled away. He left her standing. Draught worried her scarf. He had known color no notice mentioned. Panic, yes. Concealment, yes. But accident keeps a short vocabulary. I heard shape of his apology. No intent, only fear, and longer sentence beneath it, the one debt imposes when it finds a spine to lean on. We sealed panel and set Ivy back like a priest arranging linen. Lewis asked if I was satisfied. Satisfaction is a word for dinners. I would settle for sequence. Footsteps to wall, wall to stair, stair to crypt, and justice. That keeps its own ledger. Back in my room, I unfolded crossword. Wall without end, 7 letters. I wrote eternity and did not like it. I wrote cloistered and liked it less. I left spaces blank and listened to rain complete what men never do. Footsteps had ended where college had taught them to, at a wall that was only a door willing to open for the right kind of pressure. They took Selwyn at the hour when the college turns its collars up. The rain had become mist, and the porter, who never liked drama, studied the paving as if the stones had whispered sedition. Selwyn said little. He adjusted his cuffs with the threadbare elegance of a man who has lectured too long. Lewis kept a steady hand near his elbow and offered the small consolations permitted in our trade. I felt no triumph, only the faint exhaustion that follows a problem solved late. The choir were rehearsing again. Notes traveled through Tom Tower like moths refusing the flame. The tune kept the mixture of obedience and ache I had heard on the first night, tighter now, as though grief had narrowed the intervals. I lingered in the drizzle until cold persuaded me indoors. Oxford prefers its endings under roofs. In my room an envelope waited, the torn diary leaf, the ledger copy, the blue thread, 3 relics from a ruin I would never fully map. Her desk had given up other fragments, the photograph catching her listening, the pencil waiting where thought had paused. She lived in meticulous fractions. It is the tidy who leave the most unfinished. Lewis came later. Strange wants the report brisk, he said. No archaeology of motive. We will give him what is necessary, I told him, and keep the part that matters. He asked what part that might be. The unsaid, I answered. It writes the last footnote. He took this as another of my indulgences and left me to the paperwork that passes for grief. I opened her crossword. The squares had yellowed as if time had leaned in to study our progress. Wall without end, 7. I heard the cloister's hush, the secret stare, the confession of stone. I wrote cloistered and crossed it. I wrote eternal and crossed that too. The word I wanted refused me with the patience of saints. Outside, bells rehearsed their own alibis. I poured a little whiskey and tasted nothing. Selwyn had said he left her standing, and in a manner he had told the truth. She stood at the lip of a darkness she had dutifully uncovered. His panic supplied a coward's push. His shame supplied the silence after. In this city, crimes prefer footnotes to shouts and doors that yield to the right insistence. I spread the diary leaf and traced the indentation of the missing name that had begun with Sel. The graphite ridge persuaded me I would never read its completion. Some endings are mercifully incomplete. I folded the paper, lit a cigarette I would later regret, and watched the smoke consider the ceiling before. Abandoning ambition, the clue kept me company. Wall without end, perhaps not a structure but a measure, the line between living and its echo. In a fit of humility, I wrote nothing and let the blanks rest. Footsteps at the wall, the phrase had been both cruelty and kindness, an elegy delivered before the body was found. Whoever wrote that anonymous note hoped we would listen. We did eventually, by a route both obvious and absurd. When the mist had thickened into a privacy even Oxford could not legislate, I wrote the word at last. Eternity. It looked presumptuous and necessary on the page. I added the last letter with the care of a man closing a door he will not open again. The pencil point broke. I took that as sanction. I walked under the lamps, which made islands of rain. Somewhere behind the stone, Boys' voices reached for the dangerous purity of a held note. I thought of Eleanor, of her tidy courage, of the blue thread that caught and would not let go. For some, the footsteps do indeed end at the wall. For others, the tune repeats and refuses to resolve, and we, poor listeners, stand and wait while it fades where we cannot follow.